we're here. Mark, you're in Spain. I'm in sunny Scotland. Neither of which are very sunny at the moment, by all accounts. We've been in a series of conversations where I think it's fair to say we've ranged across maybe more subjects than we intended to, but we've had a conversation about this beforehand, and I think both of us have agreed we're going to try and tie this down to a fairly tight sort of set of parameters. And what I'm hoping to get into you about, Mark, is your work around the misrepresentation of money, around money as an issue that pervades far more aspects of life than maybe we have, or its misrepresentation affects more aspects of life than we've given credit to. Some of the work you've done on the fundamentals of how we can change some of these things, because it's a system we designed and we can intervene in that system. And maybe even most importantly, why those interventions, even though they might seem difficult to understand, or maybe they're you know, I don't want to say incomprehensible, because they're definitely not, but unfamiliar to people, why making those changes does not have to be a disaster in any way. And that we don't have to kind of reinvent all systems to reinvent. Now, I'd like us to get there, but I'm really interested to frame what you're doing, partly selfishly, in terms of what I've been trying to do, and I've been writing a book about sharing. But there's actually very little literature. I've only found one other book, which is explicitly about sharing, which is a book by Nicholas John in Australia, in a sort of cultural studies department, from that sort of side of you know, kind of semiotic cultural analysis of sharing, if you like. Now, in the book that I've been writing, I've taken a really wide stance. So I call it a sort of like a meditation and a kind of extended inquiry into uses of the word, practices of sharing, into, obviously, I talk about the commons, and I talk about sharing. The way I've organized the book is in three sections. I talk about, first, systems, something that you're very close to and understand. Secondly, I talk about stuff. So that's kind of distributive sharing and wealth and distribution. And then the third part of the book is about people. So it's people, systems, and stuff. And I sent you very briefly, you haven't had a chance to really study it, but very briefly, I sent you one of the studies which collates a lot of the work on child psychological development that has been done. And there is not a lot of work, actually, which is interesting in itself, into how children develop attitudes and practices and understandings around sharing. Now, given all the crazy mad things that are going off in the world, and I have personally no doubt that there are aspects of sharing in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. There are undoubtedly, you know, documents of conversations which began as early as 2011 and 12, when vast tracts, the second biggest resource of natural gas in the world, is under the Black Sea. Russia was in conversation with Ukraine. Those talks fell through. There is an aspect of the failure to share resources, which is driving, you know, even this. In the studies with children, it was found that something like only 19% of children will respond in a situation where they have two objects. The question is, will the child share one of the two things it has? So is it better to be able to play or to engage socially, you know, or is it better just to own everything in the room? And the finding is that children want to own everything in the room. Now, it's not without some degree of humor that I'm relating these things to the current, you know, dire situation. But it is incredible how, I cannot believe how incredibly, frankly, stupid politicians are on a global scale when they should be representing ordinary people. how incredibly incapable they are, seemingly willfully so, to share things rather than fight over them. I found a database of peacekeeping agreements, which dated from 1990 to 2016. It was a database of all peacekeeping agreements. It was very, very enlightening, in so much as that there is very little difference between a peacekeeping agreement and a sharing agreement. The peacekeeping agreements almost all exclusively focused on resource sharing, power sharing, and sharing of economic rights. So there's this fascinating parallel, I think, between our absolute inability at the high end of human development in international relations to be able to share things, and whatever observed, albeit that obviously the observers are maybe not without their own biases, that the observation of the development of sharing in very, very small children. Now, where I think we begin to, where I want to bring you into this, Mark, is that it seems to me there's something extrinsic and possibly systemic that prevents people from being able and to even think about the possibility. And I wonder if there might be something in our means of exchange, distribution, of sharing, that is actually encoding us, that's deprogramming us from being able to quite simply do things peacefully. You know, in the same way that we want toddlers to do that, we want our representatives in The Hague or in NATO, you know, or in the UN to be able to share nicely. Why is it so difficult? And I'm going to hand over to you, Mark, and suggest that perhaps that there is something in your work that is able to identify what that thing is, to relate it, I think, to money, and even probably more importantly, to begin to suggest how we can make some changes to that.
Okay, well, we'll try to orient that to our objective, which is the question of contracts. But it becomes obvious that we need to collaborate and we need to share in order to survive as a group, and we need that group survival. So I think sharing is a natural impulse, and possession is also a natural impulse. But I think they counterbalance each other if we're governed by some kind of common reality that is beyond any one of us, right? Which in the case of the Kalahari Bushmen, it's the forces of nature and the physical reality that they find themselves as a people. If you introduce a component that is not really a natural component, right, but that somehow is assumed to be as if it were a natural component, right, and that the logical definition or the logical understanding or illogical understanding, but the common perception of what that thing is and what the role it plays is not coherent or logically coherent between what people think it is and what it actually is, and how it actually affects you in a systemic level that maybe people are not aware of, right? Then you can interfere with that natural balance. So we have one thing, which is the ownership and possession, or whatever you want to call it, within a context, a common context that everyone understands. And then you introduce some kind of artifact that is not a real one, it's an invented one, but somehow you get people to believe that it is a real one. And now what you've done is that you've affected that balance, or the possibility of that balance that would have existed had you not introduced that artifact. If this artifice has a consistent logical understanding amongst, then we will program our behavior accordingly. And if that logical design of that artifice is such that is in some or other way invalid or logically incoherent or simply absurd, right? then we will accommodate. If we have agreed to accommodate that artifice, then our behavior will become correspondingly absurd, right? And then we will do things that we might not otherwise have done. We have a specific artifice, which is the discussion that we want to focus on today, and that is money, right? And this artifice has an effect on our behavior because we share a common notion of what money is and does. And according to our best scientific principles, that common notion is ridiculous. It's absurd. So we have this absurd notion that we are all, to some or other degree, obsessed with, some more than others, right? But the obsession is literally universal in the sense that everyone understands, or most everyone understands that money is key to survival. If I don't have money, I don't survive. So having money is linked to physical survival. So if we take that and we have this misconception of money and we carry it up to the highest levels of our society, then it's going to be expressed in those higher levels. In other words, when you were talking about all those agreements, etc., peace agreements are all based on basic economics, right? So economic resources is what gives you a strategic advantage as a social entity. So first you need the resources, then you need the ability to apply those resources, call it technology, and then then you're on the way to becoming a world power. So you everyone wants to vie for the maximum power. So the question is that there's a problem there, and I think that the focus of our discussion today is to recognize that this thing that's affecting all of our behavior, money, right, is logically misrepresented.
Well,
and we can prove.
Can I just ask you a question that relates directly to that? What you're saying is that money contracts affect all of our behaviors. So can I take it, because this is my question, this is what I'm exploring in the book.
Yeah.
Are money contracts essentially the thing that governs how we share resources?
I think the most important thing about the money contract is that the money contract essentially assumes a common understanding. It's the place in which we all go, oh, what is money? Oh, look at your contract, and and you'll see what money is, and look what it does in a contract. So people will have an idea of the money contract as being the ultimate expression, legal, and it's legally enforceable, and if the money contract is not adhered to, you can go to a court and a judge will judge and decide things, right? So the money contract is important in the sense that it determines our common notion in a kind of official sense. It's not really an explanation of what money is. No. It's basically an understanding of a contract under assumptions of what money are, right? So here are the two fundamental concepts that people, confuse often, and that is that you have to understand that judges are not experts in every domain. Mm. So a judge is going to have to assume that contracts will arise. And those contracts will arise about things that they may not be experts in. So they will say, they'll basically tolerate common practice. They'll say, okay, we have a common practice here, and it's existed and it's been tolerated by society, and so that is a way of determining the fundamental concept of a contract, which is the meeting of the minds, as they say, right? So if people have in common practice a meeting of the minds about common things, then that is a valid reference as to how to determine justice. The point is that the idea of common practice and meeting of the minds is only tolerable legally until that common practice is formally proven to be either logically wrong right? Or somehow invalid.
Well,
So
we actually had, there is an instance of that in the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers in the 18th century with people like Hume and Locke and Berkeley, and there was a whole, the expropriation was invented on the basis that a technology, if you like, which was essentially, it was the this idea that came about that mixing your labor with land created
yeah,
ownership, and that actually overstamps the kind of consents that you're talking about, which are common agreements. So philosophers like David Hume were of the view that the most powerful binding social agreements were those that came about because of mutual consent. What happened with the sort of Lockean proviso, as it became known, was that John Locke came along and said, no, actually, there is a technical mechanism by which property is created, and took away that. So essentially, what you're talking about happened, and in fact, we're not just in an assumed, relationship. That mechanism has already been tripped a few times in history. So really, the way we're operating around ownership is about 300 years old in terms of Western legal definitions of ownership. But that's highly related, but it's only tangential to what you're saying.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is that, speaking very specifically of money today, we have a common notion of money, and that is vital in all our aspects. I mean, it's vital in our relationship with our governments and society in general. It is vital with our interactions with one another, and it's vital in terms of for each and every one of us to be able to have a sense of security. And so we have to react to this reality of money. Right? So the point is the point of this discussion is to say that I think is that we have to talk about the invalidity of money and how that affects contracts. So like what I was trying to say was that no matter what our past common practice has been, our common practice, that common practice can be accepted as a source of law, right? Until certain conditions are met. People skip that. They'll sort of think, oh, well, common practice has determined it, so that's the law. No, because the law, when we're dealing about common practice, we're saying we really don't know and we really haven't specified what we're doing, but we will accept it because people's expectations have been created, and since somehow whatever we're doing here that we don't fully understand has persisted in time, it does seem to have a certain validity somehow. But if that common practice can be shown to be invalid, then that throws the whole thing, blows it all up. And this is key because what you were discussing about changes in society, about common notions, and then establishing certain realities that determine things that were not considered before. In the American legal system, and I'm trying to find the equivalent, and we've discussed that a bit. We could think about a judicial inquiry, for example, may be something that would be equivalent to the concept of a matter of first impression. So legally, a matter of first impression is the idea that the judicial system is confronted with something that it has no precedence. It's never really thought of this before, and it's of sufficient social importance that the judiciary has to come down to some kind of conclusion, and they can only do that not on precedents and on law, etc. They can only do that in terms of principles of law and justice, right?
Brief question to that, Mark.
Yeah.
Are you saying, would you take the view then that money has been, or rather money has not been defined to such an extent that to raise a legal question over its definition would actually be the first. It would not be counter to anything else, because in actual fact, money does not have a legal definition.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
In other words,
Okay.
we're basically questioning common practice,
Well,
and we're saying that common practice is invalid, and not only invalid, it's prejudicial and it's damaging.
well,
And
that's a very fundamental, wide-ranging, kind of pertinent.
yeah, it's a matter of first impression. In other words, nobody's thought of it.
No, and if you are correct about that, and obviously I wouldn't be here if I hadn't actually been already persuaded that you probably are, it is then absolutely astounding to me, and I hope it will be astounding to other people, that we are not more aware of this, that there are no widely known kind of social or political campaigns or economic questions existing that are challenging people on a daily basis to come to terms with that, because surely that requires a solution.
Yes, but the point is that the reason for that is because we are very susceptible to as a society and in general, we're very susceptible to circular logic. In other words, we're very we often will basically design our social relationships in terms of premises that arguments where the premises are already the conclusion, right? So this problem of
I mean,
this problem.
I agree. Yeah? I agree with you, Mark. I think let's not, Mark. Let's not. I think we will divert away from the subject if we explain the human behavior in terms of why. I just want to register the fact in this conversation that I am astounded, and I'm inviting other people to be astounded, that if what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, that we have not unto this point got a formal definition of what a unit of currency is, even, what is money, and yet we build so many legal contracts on top of something that isn't even defined. I'm astounded. I mean, it's outrageous. I don't want us to explain why. I just want us to acknowledge how astounding that is. And I would like to then ask you to carry on talking about let's take that as a given. And then can you talk a bit more about where does your work take you in terms of making that first definition, and what might that involve?
Well, okay, I think to stay on topic in terms of the legal contracts and their invalidity, let's just say that that conclusion is correct. But I would just add one important thing, and that is to help people understand any notion that we have, illegal notion we have, is founded on two fundamental things. One is what's called positive law, which is the law that humans make for themselves, right? And then there's this other thing called natural law that is not formally discussed, but the best way to introduce natural law or to influence positive law by natural law is to understand the concept of forensics, right? So in other words, the establishment of truth or of reality is affected by what is possible. To give you the very simplest example, we know that if there's a case of a murder case, for example, we know that if we can prove that you were in another town, right, then forensically prove that you're in another town. That means physical law, right, says that you were in another town, then you cannot have been the person who committed the crime. And that bears on our vision of responsibility, etc. So forensics is a way of impacting whatever agreements we come up and we conjure in our social interactions, right? So the point being made there is that fundamentally we have positive law, which is the law that human beings create, and then we have the law of God or the law of nature or whatever that impacts that, and that's a very important thing to establish. So the other thing is that the way that we determine reality, between what we consider our interaction, right? The way we deal with that is through the use of logic, reason. Right? So in other words, we have to count the kilometers between the two places. Is it physically possible with the means of transport that this person could have been part of the time in one place, and then sufficiently and time enough to come back and commit the murder, right? So or commit the crime. So we have to do these calculations, and we are completely open to them. And we think that justice is served when we introduce those calculations and those ideas. So the question is that one of the fundamental principles, right, of law then is not just that we agree and we have a meeting of minds on a conceptual level, and we say, oh yeah, but we both decided to agree that money is blah, 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 right? But that definition of money has to be understood in a coherent, logical fashion that makes sense, right? We can't have a contract where based on elephants, and then apply that to a transaction based on chickens, right? Because chickens and elephants are not the same thing, and we can tell they're not the same thing for reasons that go beyond positive law, right? So the equivalence of chickens with elephant, one elephant's equal to a chicken is an absurdity. And no matter how much our minds can meet on that and agree with that, it's still absurd. And a judge would say, I'm sorry, I can't preside over this contract. I'm not going to give anybody favor anybody, because you're nuts, both of you. So get this thing out of my court, so similarly, the thing is that it's not so obvious with money, because it's more the way the money's been misrepresented logically in our society is, I don't believe, is the action of any mastermind. I think it's a thing that evolved. It's an error in human evolution that we made a long time ago for reasons we can discuss in another video, and we should discuss another video. So take note of that. But the point is that we can prove logically that our common notion is absurd of money, and we can show that that's the case within the contracts. That we can show that the contracts around money actually embrace that misrepresentation, because the misrepresentation is focused on one logical concept, and that is that anything can be defined as being both a unit of measure as well as adhering to the properties of a commodity, if you will, or some kind of product, right? So if you think of all the class of all the different types of products, services, physical products, whatever, and you think about all the things that they have in common, right? And you say, okay, that's how we define what a product is. And then you say, okay, a unit of measure, these are all the requirements for something to be a unit of measure. You find that they don't overlap. So they're mutually exclusive. So to combine those two concepts into one is a logical misrepresentation.
Can I just
because,
Marc, the best way, I'm thinking about, again, anybody coming to this for the first time, the best way I explain this to myself, you can tell me if I'm wrong, in terms of incompatibility of something being a unit of measure and also being a commodity in itself, that those two things,
tradable object,
yes, tradable object, like
subject to supply,
like an industrial good, you can supply it. One is a concept, one is a thing. The best way I have found, or a good way to think about that, is to imagine employing a surveyor to tell you how big your roof is, and then asking the surveyor, would she please save up enough square centimeters so that she could actually come and do the job? That she would need to bring the centimeters with her, and only when she had enough centimeters in her possession could she tell you how big your roof is, because having the concept of having a common definition of the concept of what a centimetre is not enough. Somehow I need my surveyor to come, but I need to know she has the centimetres. It's just an alien concept, and yet I think what you're saying is we actually do this with money.
We actually do that with money in practice, and what's even worse is that she'll come along and she'll say, sorry, these are the centimeters I have, so your roof can't be any bigger than the number of centimeters I have.
Yes, yeah, well, that's an even, yeah. So
and not only that, is that if I come back tomorrow, the value of my centimeters will have changed, and so the size of your roof will have changed, and obviously it hasn't.
The simple fact is, before contracts, before money, before anything, it's very simple for me to ask a surveyor to measure my roof, and a surveyor can say, yes, I will measure your roof. Interestingly, nobody has mentioned money.
That's right. That's right. That's right. You can figure out without money. But anyway, going back to our point is that this misrepresentation, you know, if people want to discuss whether that's true or not, all I can say is that we have formal proofs to that effect, and we can show that, and that we have a precedent in our in the idea of data management for those who are computer aware enough to know the foundations of object-oriented programming, which is sort of the standard today. There's a concept of multiple inheritance, and that is an object cannot be defined in terms of two otherwise disparate classes, right? So in other words, each object has to pertain to a class, and if you have a new object, you have to either create a new class with a new set of properties, but what you can't do is, in your paradigm, your ontological paradigm, is to start doing what's called multiple inheritance or horizontal inheritance, which means that you're now borrowing properties from pre-existing classes and creating hybrids, right? And there's a problem with data definition and discussing it, which is to be avoided, and it is avoided in many ways. And without getting into particulars, it's a recognized problem. Call it multiple inheritance. So it's a logical problem fundamentally. It's not a mechanical problem.
On that subject of not getting into particulars, we can't avoid doing that to some extent, but we've agreed today we're going to try and talk about the misrepresentation of money.
Sure.
But we're also then, and I think we have done that. Now, we were then going to talk, I want to talk about how this might begin to get fixed. And I know you have ideas about this. Yeah. And then the third point, and I'm aware that we've only got sort of 20 minutes left to talk. The third point is, and I think the third point is, in some ways, if you can accept the first two, is by far the most important, which is to explain why fixing this problem is not so invasive or idealistic, if you like, even,
or disruptive,
and it's certainly not so impossible that it would mean any kind of dissembling of the world or a kind of falling apart of what we have, and that actually it is kind of consanguineous, you know, it works with the systems that we have. So I just wonder if we can go now. We've got only 20 minutes, and can we begin to, let's park the idea of money's misrepresentation if we can. I think you've done a huge.
We'll take that it's misrepresented.
Okay.
Given that it's misrepresented, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And from a legal point of view, is that it's intolerable. Once we've determined.
So let's take that as a given. Now let's move in the last part of the conversation.
Sure. But I'm saying is that legally, which is what we've established already, is that legally, to be consistent, any legal system that's worth its weight in salt would have to say, well, if it's proven that this concept is money is misrepresented, between the parties, then the contracts around that misrepresentation are invalid. And I just wanted to add something very important, is that from a legal point of view, there are three fundamental ideas of misrepresentation. And the first one is innocent, we just don't know. The other one is through negligence. And the third one is through fraud, right? So the very important thing here is that once the question has been raised that the money is misrepresented, then there are only two possibilities, is that we have to, we either prove that what nonsense, money is not misrepresented, everybody understands perfectly what money is, and that misrepresentation is
Negligence or
that
fraudulent.
notion is valid too, because it's not just enough to say that people agree with this and everyone knows. The question is that we have to also show that it's valid. So if people want to take that tack, they can try to come up with the proofs, and they won't succeed, in my opinion. But the point is that so once we've established that money is misrepresented, and it hasn't been formally stated anywhere nor ratified in any kind of document or whatever, so that everybody can refer to, it's very important what I'm saying now, right? So once that is established, then there is a legal imperative for all parties of a contract to participate in clarifying that term. So if we take any kind of term in a contract, and let's not talk about money, let's just talk about any other term in the contract. If you and I sign a contract, and at any point in time, one of us, let's put it even more bluntly, if you are responsible for writing up the contract, so you're the author of the contract, and I'm the other party of the contract, and I come up with a question about a term in that contract, then you are obliged to retain your rights under that contract. You are obliged to explain that contract and proactively help clarify what that term means. And if it turns out that we did not have a meeting of the minds, then we have to modify that contract correspondingly so that it can still work somehow and still have some modicum amount of validity or whatever, right? So that's the situation we are with the money thing. And this goes on to why there's no harm going to be created, because what we're doing is that we're not looking to punish anyone. Is that the problem that we're dealing with right now is not the problem of money's misrepresentation. We're dealing now with the claim that money is misrepresented. Okay?
Yeah.
Now I'm sure that money is misrepresented, and I can prove it technically, right? But the point is that once I go to the contract guy and I say, look, we got a problem here. Yeah, this term money, where is it defined and specified? It's not a product of nature. It says so if you're going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it. I don't understand what money is. To me, it's not clear. So we're using this term in this contract called money, right? And it has all sorts of relationships with things and all, but I'm not clear about that, right? So as the other party of this contract, I am requesting that it be clarified.
Our minds have met. I get it, right?
Yeah.
Now,
good.
my question to you is,
Yes.
you want to know that from whom, where? I want you to tell me. I want you to give me a real example of how you're asking that question, who you're asking it to, and where it will be asked, and even under what jurisdiction, because I want to know how we make this happen.
Sure. But I know that. But
So
what I'm trying to say,
things.
what I'm saying is that whatever common money contract, which would be with any kind of financial institution, it could even be with your government, which is an interesting take, right? Choose whoever you think it might be. We have to decide how to do that, right?
Let's go there. This is where I want.
No. But here, the point is, the principle is the same. So the principle is that there exists a contract that both parties are expecting the judiciary to support and to enforce, right? Because ultimately, what the judiciary determines will translate into the physical force of the law. That means a bailiff or somebody with physical force will be able to take something away from one party and give it to the other.
Well, hypothetically, yes.
But this is what happens every day. So our question is that we have a common notion. So take any money contract that exists, and we take that before the judiciary and we discuss it.
Has this happened? Has what you're talking about hypothetically happened anywhere?
No, it hasn't happened in the terms that we've discussed.
Something else has been discussed, but specifically what you're talking about hasn't been raised as a legal question. And am I right in saying what you're talking about, is it the misrepresentation of money? Is that what's standing trial?
No, what we want to bring to the judiciary is the knowledge that we have that money is indeed a universally misunderstood concept and idea, and is logically misrepresented in the sense that the logic that everyone assumes money is invalid, and we can prove that, right? So that's the point. But the point is that how we go about this is difficult, because again, there's no point in trying to start this up in some kind of fledgling little action that you'll die and you'll go to your grave being right and nobody will care, because nobody really have understood anything and it wouldn't have resonated throughout our society. So what we need to do,
you would need to start this question in the light of some publicity and possibly around a significant money contract. I mean, something that would affect.
Well, I think the first thing that we're trying to do, and we should do, that is to inform authorities in economics, right, central banks, etc., that money's not defined, and ask them for their formal definition, specification of money.
I want to check something before you go on. To inform economic authorities that money is not defined. That's not in the context of that's not a legal case. That's an academic.
No, it's very pertinent to one, because in that information, you let them know that all of the legal principles that come to bear on how they respond.
Could not that question
that they have
could that question not be raised in the light of a legal case? Could not both of those two things happen at the same time, so that the practical informs?
Well, let's put it this way: before you sue anyone, right? Before you sue anyone, you normally are required to basically try to solve the problem, without going to court.
Gotcha.
So you basically inform them of the situation and you ask them their side of it. Right?
In the civil terms, it's a letter before action.
So I mean, if you want to say, going back to who, you would say, well, the who are the authors of contracts, right? So the authors of contracts are typically banks and financial institutions, right? So we're going to inform them and give them all of the reasons why we think that this notion of money is not properly, and we're not blaming anyone, we're just saying we have this problem, right? Yep. And can you help us satisfy that? And then we know that, and we will inform them of the legal requirement for them to be proactive as
so would you put some time limit on that in terms of beginning to see some?
Well, the first thing that you do is that you create a bunch of letters that you write to the appropriate authorities. You get their response, right? And then, or their lack of response, but that's very significant too. And then that is your evidence. And you say, well, I have tried to solve this problem in a friendly way and in a collaborative, and I can't. So now I have to go to court.
And you're doing this to the extent of your knowledge, you're doing this in the context of a first impressions case, because I have some experience of doing this toward a judicial review, which was to establish a class action based on certain principles, which I also had to put before authorities and exemplify before I could challenge it. We got some funding from the Legal Service Commission, so I've sort of been down that road a little bit. So once, presumably contained within that, there would be a sort of suggested format or time limit for addressing these problems.
Right.
But you couldn't really exemplify the problem until you got into the specific of a legal money contract and tested it against reality. I suspect. I don't know.
Can you repeat that again? I'm not sure.
I'm asking whether you feel that having an address to the general, if you like, authors of contracts, authoritative economic experts and bodies, whether that could be sufficient to solve the problem, or in fact you would need to test. I mean, it seems to me you would need some kind of a real legal case testing a real contract to sort of flesh out the theory of that conversation, if you like, that it would stay open-ended until you tested it against something that was active in the world, something concrete. No, but my point to you, Marc, is that you are in the territory always until you test it against something in practice that is legally defined, although you're dealing with an underlying lack of definition of money terms. Yes.
You have to prepare the terrain so that you know that the key issue is going to be heard and discussed, and that's where we're at now. But the point I'm trying to make about the preemptive is that we have to test, but what we're testing isn't what we're testing simply is if there exists a definition and whether that definition has been ratified, and that the definition that has been ratified publicly can be tested to be true or false. So our point is that we won't, that what we know for sure is that the system, economics and finance, have not defined money. The basic claim that I have been able to deduce from my discussions in this issue is that money is like a natural phenomena that's always been there, which is wrong. But anyhow, it has its own properties on its own, independent of humanity, and that's not the case. So we can prove that easily. So the fundamental issue is that the first issue that we have to get clear is that we have to manifest with some kind of authority the fact that they don't know what money is.
Yeah, you've explained really well what you're talking about with the misrepresentation of money, the money problem, if you like. I think you've also now given people a good understanding, something that they can begin to get their teeth into and maybe investigate more themselves. But more importantly, I think you've identified the first stage of how we begin to address this, to fix it. And I'm with you. You've persuaded me, and I don't think I'm an easy sell. I've asked you endless questions. I know I've been a pain, and I've troubled you many hours of the day. And I think you have enough strong information out there and work in the world that people can do that. So you've also explained, I asked you the question, how can this be supported? If people begin to be persuaded, as I am, that there is something that we are misattributing causes to lots of really big social problems, which, whilst some of them might be correct, a large number of them could actually be due to systemic failings in the money system. And I think you're right about this. Now, we've explained that. We've looked at how we might fix it. Now, I wonder if we can just, in this same video, because I think it's important to keep these things together, can you just talk about, let's try and contain this to no more than 10 minutes. Let's move on through the fix, okay? And let's make an assumption that we're going to back ourselves. I know you're going to back yourself. And let's say you're right about at least the fundamentals of this. Can you explain to people a little bit about where we're going? This is the fear factor that people feel when they're asked to intervene in something they've taken for granted, or a system that they probably believe works fundamentally. If you raise that doubt and people have asked those questions and they say, actually, okay, we can see that this is causing more problems than we first knew, we apply some of the fixes that you're suggesting, or we begin. Can you talk to people about what the likely outcomes are, or at least what you can sort of rationally deduce can and can't happen, and basically why that does not have to be a sort of a fundamental intervention of potentially catastrophic proportions, that actually we can implement some of the fixes you're suggesting within the systems that we have. So within existing banking, credit transactions, electronic transactions, escrow, all these real things in the world, the system of finance. Can you explain to us how that system can begin to accommodate some of the changes that you're proposing? That's a lot to do in 10 minutes. I don't know if that's a fair ask.
Well, to make it as brief as possible, fundamentally, we can, once we've recognized that there is a lack of definition, then we can understand immediately that lack of definition will create some kind of inefficiency at very least. But we can also easily prove and that is historically well established by economics and finance. There's no discussion here that by virtue of accommodating this notion of money, we are enabling what is called a series of mathematical relationships that give way to instability. And that instability, what it does is it compounds risk, what's called financial risk. So in our last paper, we distinguish the real economy, which is real goods and services that are basically rooted in real resources. You know, a teacher might be just a service teaching, but that teacher has to eat, has to live in a house, etc. So there are physical resources required to provide that service. So we have a whole bunch of things that are essentially the real core of our economy, which is called the real economy. And this distinction is being made in think tanks like like in the Bain report, where they discuss the difference between the real economy and the financial economy. Right. So the financial economy produces all of this risk, and in fact harbors 2/3 of the overall risk, and that's sort of an established figure, right? So we have 100% of financial risk, of which only 1/3 corresponds to the real world, right? And 2/3 to this financial, thing that is basically fueled by this misconception of money. Is that by virtue of this misrepresentation of money, what we're doing is we're generating risk, which is really completely external to the real economy. But since everything that we do, the 3/3 of that risk has to be resolved ultimately in that 1/3 of the real economy. So basically what we're doing is we're just basically loading our real economic reality, our real economy, with a bunch of risk that doesn't need to exist. So anything that will clarify that risk, right, and reduce that risk would be a reduction of risk for any agent in the system. So what we're discussing now is we're discussing a way to continue functioning with our same credit cards and our the mechanics would be the same, but to make a conceptual change in our understanding of the knowledge base, if you will, or the ontology of money, such that everybody will experience immediate reduction of risk. So that the key here is to understand that once we've clarified this concept that we don't have clear, which is what we've established in the first part, it's not clear and needs to be clarified by legal imperative now. It's not something we choose to do. It's something that for the legal establishment to maintain its credibility, it will have to accept this challenge, right? It'll have to say, we have to clarify this point. So once we're clarifying this point, what we're doing is that we know that any consequence of that through mutual clarification and mutual understanding will reduce risk for everybody.
Yeah.
The question is that how much is that risk reduction going to be? And the thing is that will that loss of risk for everybody compensate any loss of future returns that somebody in the current paradigm of money's misrepresentation will feel that they're losing? Well, because to fix the problem, we don't have to go into anybody's account and take money away from them or take their stuff away from them. All we're doing is we're saying conceptually, let's figure out what we're going to do from now on and into the future. So whatever your accounts are now, you keep that. But the question is that what those accounts are going to mean and how you're going to use those accounts to satisfy your needs as an agent in the system are going to, the circumstances are going to change. But also the risk is going to be greatly reduced because we're all going to know what we're doing, right? So essentially it's not a destructive approach. It's not a belligerent approach where we're going after the bad guys and demanding justice and taking things away from them. We're demanding clarification on something that affects everybody, and they can reduce risk for everyone, right?
I think it's it makes there's a few responses. The first one is it makes perfect sense now. I mean, I just think this is a very clear proposition, and I think what you're describing is something that even Marc Carney or someone like that who's written a book about public values, the need for this is actually quite widely acknowledged, but the real kind of trigger is less acknowledged. You know, the actual sort of detail of how we get into defining risk, actually. And one thing I wanted to say to you when I'm listening to you talk about risk, do you think risk is a really central thing that we
Well,
all
the question is that you can create risk in anything, right? In other words, if you play a game with no necessary consequence to the real world, within the context and definition of that game, there'll be a risk of you winning or losing, right?
I'm more interested in the perception of risk than risk itself. It's like the fear of.
No, I know, but the perception of risk is ludicrous if it doesn't come to bear in some way in the physical world. And what happens is that if you don't pay your mortgage, you lose your house, and that's very clear. That the risk in playing the money game translates into some kind of convention that takes your house away from you, and your kids in the street are still the same.
I think that's really what I wanted to establish, Mark, because I think there is a common. I mean, businesses talk about de-risking ventures all the time.
Yeah, and their approach is. I mean, that's a technical discussion we can take.
Yes.
I really strongly suggest that people to understand how this risk is treated financially in a kind of most colloquial way possible. And I really suggest that anyone, even people who are adverse to mathematics, because there's some mathematics, but I provide all of the study notes necessary to get up to speed on the mathematical concepts used there, which is pretty elementary, high school level, really. But still, a lot of people have forgotten their most basic math. So is the beast of compounding you may not have noticed, which I really suggest people read that, because it really takes you through right from extracting resources to producing end products, and the effect the financial system has because of our perception of money. And the basic notion there is that it's explained how that risk compounds even if you don't have mortgages. You know, it just on the idea of charging transaction fees on a percentage, and then that charge being passed on down the value chain. So I really strongly suggest that. But I think that the most important thing is that people realize that there is no clear definition. There's a legal imperative to resolve that lack of definition, and that's not something that we can pretend isn't there. We can manifest the reality that there is no definition by asking the appropriate authorities their opinion or how they substantiate their notion of money when they write and create or are authors of these money contracts. And then we can, on that basis, establish how we can collectively act to deal with this problem in an intelligent way. And I think that this endeavor is far more constructive than any of the left and right political things that are basically predicated on this problem.
I absolutely agree with you. What in your own words, let's just finish this conversation if we can with I want to ask you, I mean, you've given some great links and there's some good information in there. The Beast of Compounding, I would recommend people read that. But if you're somebody who's been listening to this, maybe you're, preoccupied with social justice or environmental justice, or you're a campaigner for peace and equality, or any other, whatever your bag is, okay. If you're persuaded, at least to some extent, that, and I think what we're putting to people is the idea that your campaign will be suffering under the yoke of some, if not all, of the problems that you're talking about. If we can manage to persuade people, and I'm openly trying to do that, I'm trying to support you in doing that. What would you be asking them to do in order to help you further the sort of cause of questioning money's misrepresentation? What's the next thing? What do you actually need assistance to do? How do we support it?
Well, I'm calling on you directly.
Well, that's cheating.
And if you put this online, you're committed, right? to become an active spokesman for our project. And I will say two things. Our project is our association is not a fiscal entity. So we don't receive money as the MSTA. We're just thinkers that have established what's going on, and there's no way to buy us, sell us, or do anything like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But as individuals, right, we can act. And I strongly suggest, and I hope that you will participate in this and forming. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to have a large manpower, but just to form some kind of legal entity that can act on what the MSTA says. So what the MSTA says is independent of what any other actors do. In that sense, we form an entity, and that entity has to start to receive income of this funny money that we're all operating on to be able to sustain itself long enough to take this to its ultimate conclusion.
Yeah.
And we do that through donations, etc. Once we're able to communicate this to enough people who become interested, then what we need to find lawyers and people who have the ability to come together with us to fully sketch out a legal strategy to take this. And I strongly suggest that the United Kingdom would be one of the best places to do that, because you have the notion of common law, etc., that I think still exists. And the United States might be, but to actually take this and to voice it, right? Once that idea has been voiced, and once we can get a following of as quickly as possible to make this as viral as possible, and then to have very clear disciplined focus with legal people, technical people, and that's already outlined in a project that we already proposed, right? So we know how to do that. There are two angles of that, and I would strongly suggest that people really read carefully, because this is not just a propaganda thing. This is, a meaningful document, which is called the MSTA resolutions, and that tries to make the whole problem, bring it together in one page so that people can understand what we're doing, what we're asking for, right? And it's all very, very reasonable if you bother to study it enough. And so the next step is to make this entity that's going to be a fiscal entity that is now going to act in one or other jurisdiction. I strongly suggest that it act both in the European jurisdiction, but also in Britain. That would be very good. I think that the British people would be more amenable to this than maybe the confused European Union, and then make this an issue and have this resonate, and of course accentuate the fact that we're not hurting anyone, we're not attacking anyone, we're all guilty. We've all, stumbled into this without. We all are guilty of not doing our due diligence, and now we just want to do it.
Was the famous phrase? We're in this together, as the famous phrase went.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a common problem that we're going to solve.
Yeah.
So that's
a good answer, Mark. I like what you did there. When I asked how can people support you, I found out that they've got to support me, which is fine. That's all right. I don't know what. I mean, what I've been doing is just, I've been trying to. I've occasionally tagged you on social media, and when I'm in conversations with people, and I think probably people of a left-leaning persuasion are a good place to start, although not exclusively, because I think there's a lot of people on the right, including Adam Smith, if indeed he was on the right, who have a great deal of problem with the compound interest and that, without going back into it. So I think it does cut across all political spectrums. So, you've got my support on this. I appreciate you answering the question, because I didn't quite understand what you meant about a sort of fiscal entity, but I do see now, and I think that fundamental value that the MSTA it remains a group of thinkers who are, working purely on a problem, if you like, and not vested in terms of one outcome. We don't know what the outcome is, so it's not really possible. But yeah, I'm thoroughly in agreement with you, and so I'm quite happy to try and get the idea out.
But it's important if we want to act. I would specifically recommend you as and myself together and other people to get involved with actually writing that letter to those people. But first, we need an entity. So if we can form some kind of entity with any people that you know that are amenable to this idea, that are willing to embrace it, that already exists, for example, that would be sufficient. The one that we don't have to create one, we can just have one that says that already exists, that takes on this challenge, and to work with them.
But yeah, thank you for answering that. I hope we've made it a little clearer. We've run on a bit more than I wanted to, but I think it certainly in that last half of this conversation, I hope that you have clarified some things for me. So I hope that people will, and it seems to the answer, I think, to my question, when I say what can people really do, is just inform yourself. It's not something that is going to be figuring in your antenna. It's not going to be on your screen. The mainstream media won't bring this problem to you. So, you know, I think you are evidently have done your best and are still doing your best. I'm very happy to join you because I think it's worthwhile and it's legitimate. And I think you're absolutely right to identify that all you're really asking people to do is inform themselves. And we've got you've created some, you know, worthwhile material to start doing that. So yeah, okay, well, power to everybody's elbow. I mean, it's not as if there's any real problems in the world that need addressing. And on we go. Thanks for talking to me again, Mark. It's appreciated.
Okay, good. All the best.